Welcome back. Hope everyone had a good weekend. So this week we're going to talk about the Caribbean. This is pulling off of Latin America. So this is again a really, we looked at Latin America. Why is this region a region? While Mexico, geographically speaking, from a physical perspective, could technically be more aligned, even politically, be more aligned with North America. We're looking at like plate tectonics. Generally speaking, everything north of the Panama Canal, or therefore north of Colombia, is slightly broken up. Most of us remember from elementary school, we learned about North America versus South America. North America, technically speaking, in that perspective, was everything north of Colombia. But then we also refer to Central America. So again, it can be very ambiguous, and a lot of how the regions, just kind of a reminder, a lot of how the regions are categorized as regions, a lot of times also has to do with where we're talking about. So if I ask you how many continents are there, depending on where you went to school, I'm thinking more nationally speaking here, you might have a different answer. So for example, that was one of the things I always found interesting when I lived in South America, was that there were less continents that people were taught about in South America, whereas in North America, we broke North America and South America. They just had the Americas. So this helps us, and you'll see with this region. So we're talking about 26 countries and dependent territories. There's a lot of the islands that are still dependent territories. So you can see this is much more, we've got Belize. It's not just where places are located, right? And then we have Guyana, French Guiana, and Suriname, 3 countries that are technically on South America. Again, so sorry, they're South America, but they're not Latin America, I should say. This region is how we characterize it generally as this concept of isolated proximity. It kind of contradicts itself. Proximity makes you think that something sounds close, but isolated sounds far. So it is very close. This region is very close to the United States. From Cuba, from Florida, you can actually see the 2 places. A lot of these other, this is a very short boat ride or a plane hop from most of these places to the next place, yet they're very isolated. And there's a lot of different factors that influence this, and especially from the States. They're very close to the States, but yet they're very isolated from the States. So this is an interesting term that we apply to this region when we talk about its isolated proximity. Okay, so here's the learning objectives. You can go ahead and look at these on your own. I'm not going to cover these, just kind of a summary again. So the Caribbean. It has a much more diverse colonial history than what we saw in Latin America. Latin America generally had very similar tendencies, either by Portuguese or Spanish conquistadores. Whereas the colonial history is very much more diverse in the Caribbean. We largely see a dominance of plantation agriculture. Again, there's not necessarily a lot of other natural minerals and resources that were exportable. And as well as due to that, we have a uncertain economic well-being for the region. Some countries and islands do very well. A lot of this would actually be more influenced whether or not they've been able to tap into tourism or some type of other industry. But generally speaking, there's great disparity in distribution of wealth and income equality throughout the islands. So physical geography. Sorry, I'm kind of getting over a cold. What really this region is largely characterized by altered landscapes, we call it. So they have the land use has been drastically changed over time, and this is not just recent, but this is over the last few hundred years. Large, huge, massive destruction of forests across the region. There's a couple islands or countries that have been able to maintain or reforest, and we'll talk about that soon here in a minute. We've also seen unrelenting cultivation of soils. So again, going back to the plantation concept here, this is a lot of demand on these soils. And we're talking about over centuries now of cultivation. And we've also seen a great part of extinction of many endemic plants and animals. For somebody who's not aware of what endemic means, I think especially with islands, it's always good to know. We tend to divide plant and animal species into a few different types of categories, and I'm not really thinking like biological classifications and categories, but whether or not they belong in a place, especially when you're looking at islands. And this does exist elsewhere, but islands, because of their isolation, it's a much more clear cut. So when we talked about something being endemic, we're talking about it being there and only being there. The nene, the Hawaiian state bird, is endemic to the Hawaiian Islands. A lot of endemic species in Hawaii actually are extinct now. So if you look at an endemic species, is a plant or animal species that is only found in the islands, or it could be we have some species of plants that are only found, as well as animals, in a specific part of one specific island in the Galapagos, for example. We have a plant called Scalesia, and there's 7 different subspecies in one island, but each is actually only found in a different region of the island, depending on the side of the island, the elevation, climatic variables. Native is when we have an animal or a plant that is found in one place. It actually is from that place, but it's also found in other places. So we have some plants, for example, that are found here in Hawaii, but they're also found in the Galapagos. Introduced and invasive is another concept. So an introduced species is something that wasn't from here but has been brought in, and then invasive is basically when it proliferates to the extent that it's starting to cause problems for that particular area. So as we've seen with a lot of islands, extinction of many endemic plants and animals. So what regions here actually are consisting? There are some questions on your exams regarding some of these concepts. So we call this Caribbean Sea Links. Basically, we've divided the islands, or divided this region into 3 areas. We have the Greater Antilles, the Lesser Antilles, and the Rimland. Greater Antilles basically are these larger islands up here, further north and west. The Lesser Antilles are these smaller islands, so these ones down here. And then the Rimland is the Belize and then the Guianas and Suriname. So on the outer area. So this area is not, most of us associate this area regarding natural disasters with hurricanes, which there are a lot of hurricanes, and we'll talk about in a minute as well. But there's actually a lot of tectonic activity. So most of the islands are located on the Caribbean tectonic plate. For example, I don't know if many of you would remember, but there was a huge earthquake in Haiti in 2010, which caused a lot of problems and a lot of deaths, and it wasn't just so much, the infrastructure was not able to withstand the earthquake, but then it was also the infrastructure wasn't really in place afterwards. There was a huge issue as well with a lot of UN workers went down to try and help out humanitarian aid, and they actually I don't know if there's an actual lawsuit, but there was discussion of the Haitian government wanting to bring a lawsuit towards UN workers, claiming that they actually caused a huge cholera outbreak. But so anyways, you can see, and this was actually, I think, one of the first times where we started seeing technology being applied to this concept of crisis mapping and humanitarian aid. It was one of the first instances where we saw this. And then there's certain things on your phone as well that you can use to communicate that doesn't require necessarily cellular service, but it uses like a low range, a low amount of data. So if anybody was on the islands right after the nuclear bomb scare a few weeks ago, you'll notice that you maybe couldn't make a phone call. And this might have happened in other places for you as well if you've tried to make a phone call and there's some type of crisis going on. The lines block up, but there's different apps you can use, and they were able to create a different system. Your book explains this a lot more, but they were able to create a system to help map where people were located to help get people there. University of Hawaii has a couple of researchers who were working on drones, as they're most commonly known as, to help humanitarian aid services and location of victims post-disaster. And this was largely done in Indonesia. They've done it a lot of areas in Southeast Asia following typhoons and cyclones. So climate. This is a region that, for the most part, has some relatively stable climate. You can see temperatures are pretty consistent throughout the year, much like we see with Hawaii. Rainfalls, however, are very variable, and rainfalls are kind of like here in a way. We have some similar altitude. This is right about the same altitude as Hawaii is located, but the rainfall is largely, you'll see it's based on um, ocean currents that bring different amounts of weather. The same thing happens for Galapagos as well. So Caribbean climate and climate change. Caribbean generally as a region is not a contributor, but it is a victim to climate change. So they're not really consuming a lot of fossil fuels. And again, a lot of the fossil fuel production actually comes from manufacturing of goods, not necessarily driving a vehicle. But this region is definitely, much as we'll see with Oceania, taking the brunt force of climate change impacts. So, if sea level rises are from 3 to 10 feet, we're talking about nations being just decimated and becoming underwater. Seasonality is based on rainfall more than temperature. So you actually get the rainy season and non-rainy or less rainy season, because it still does rain in the dry season, but these can be really heavy rains. Hurricanes are also very typical of the region. You can see here there's a big palm tree that is just virtually crashed right on top of somebody's home, and it's not hard to understand how these homes don't withstand the storms. You can see they're based on just basic architecture. So hurricanes, we're just going to talk a little bit about this here as well. Hurricanes are defined by wind speeds of 74 miles per hour or more. And they typically enter through the Lesser Antilles. If you remember, that's further down south, the smaller islands that we saw. So again, this region is not a major contributor to greenhouse gases, but it's extremely vulnerable to climate change effects. So sea level rise, which we just talked about, but also we're seeing increased storm intensity. As you'll remember from over the last couple of years, more and more storms are happening, larger storms are happening, and more frequent large storms are happening. There are still islands that have had to be evacuated and are not inhabitable since the storms of last summer, in the last couple of years as well. So we're also getting different amounts of rainfall, so variable rainfall are creating floods, whereas other years, the rain patterns are changing, I should say, so you're also getting droughts in opposite years. And this is also leading to a loss of biodiversity, so ocean acidification, ocean warming will lead to basically the death, that's bleaching of corals. And it can also greatly, if we're talking about bird species or different land species, it can greatly impact their ability to reproduce. I know in Galapagos we talk about with El Nino, the blue-footed boobies is an iconic species in Galapagos. And it's the years that we have El Nino, they can't reproduce. It just doesn't happen, or it barely does, I should say. Some are able to successfully, but the way the blue-footed boobies work is that they mate for life. So they have, they successfully choose a mate, and how it's been explained to me is they fly up above and basically take aerial photos of wherever they've decided to have their nest. And they don't build a nest per se, but the two animals will fly back to the same spot every year and mate and lay an egg, and they take turns caring for the nest, and then they go away, and then they come back the next year. But during years of extreme flooding related to El Nino, there's so much plant growth that they can't find the spot where they're supposed to go back and nest. So huge, we might not think about it too much. Oftentimes we think about the repercussions of floods and droughts more associated with human impacts, but it also can drastically impact the success of other animal and plant species as well. So hurricanes. Hurricanes are, there's a reason why hurricanes are so proliferate in this area. So the one thing, and this will, looking at this diagram will kind of help you understand why we're seeing more and more hurricanes and larger hurricanes today. So the number one thing that a hurricane needs to form and that it needs to continue to fuel itself is warm ocean water. So you need water more than 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And this continually provides the energy for hurricanes. So when you hear about hurricanes making landfall, it takes a while, but they get weaker. And they get weaker because you're cutting off their source of, of this warm water. Okay, sorry. And then you have winds coming up. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so then you have to have the winds to be right. It's actually interesting where if you get strong winds that are high enough, it literally can basically cut off the head, or we would say, of a hurricane, and it kills it right then and there. So you have to have the right winds coming up. It sounds kind of like a perfect storm, but it kind of is. You can see then, and then as we're getting this warm, moist air that goes up, winds blow outward above the storm, allowing the air below to rise. So it's creating this cyclical system, right? Humid air is rising, making the clouds of the storm, and then you have to have the right amount of winds. They can't be too fast. They have to be light winds that allow it to grow and push it slowly across the ocean. And this is one of the things that we've also seen these storms moving a lot faster. But there's a certain amount, I forget what the wind speed is and the height, but it basically will, oh, sorry, let me get rid of this for you. Okay. Okay, so here's what we see. You might have also heard of cyclones and typhoons. People are usually surprised to find out that cyclones and typhoons and hurricanes are all actually the same exact thing. It just depends on where they are located. So you can see in the southern hemisphere, over by Asia, we call these Asia and Africa, Indian Ocean area, Pacific Ocean, we would call these cyclones, whereas north of the equator, we call these typhoons. And then in the Atlantic and Pacific, that is west of the Americas, we call these hurricanes. We can get hurricanes here in the Hawaiian Islands, but it's not too common. What most people are also interested to find out, or they find interesting, is that the hurricanes actually start as storms. Not all of them, but a lot of them start as storms, tropical storms, over by Africa, and they're slowly moving across. Which again, the slower they move, the more powerful they can become, and the longer they last, and the longer they can stay in a place as well. So some other environmental issues that we're seeing in this region. Belize, for example, this is a little bit similar to some other Central American countries. There's been some wildlife conservation, to say. They've led to a lot of preserves. This is wildlife preserves to try and create sanctuaries for species that otherwise wouldn't have these areas. A lot of these can be private as well. You will find these in some other islands, but not too much. What else do we got? Okay, Haiti is a country. It's one of the poorest countries. It's the poorest country in this hemisphere. Haiti suffers from severe deforestation and soil erosion. This is partially related to policy, but this is also partially related to the infrastructure that exists. And a lot of people still use wood and charcoal for cooking. El Yunque, it's actually, if you ever get a chance, I believe it's the only tropical rainforest national park. Technically, we're a little too far to be considered tropical rainforest here in Hawaii, but it's the only tropical rainforest that's a U.S. Forest Service. It's a really cool little waterfall. It's actually kind of a big waterfall with a big swimming pool at the bottom. Dominica is another. So a lot of these countries have also really tried to build off of ecotourism as well. There's a lot of poverty. You can see here the land use covers. So some areas still have tropical forest, but a lot of it has been converted to cropland, not everywhere. Cuba, Dominican Republic have been a lot more successful at keeping a lot of their natural forests as well. So generally is what we're seeing across the region is plantations have replaced forest cover. Deforestation in Haiti is largely due to rapid population growth and the fact that they still rely on charcoal and wood for food or for cooking. Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico have retained significant forest cover. This is partially due to environmental restrictions and partially due to access as well. Could also be due to markets. There's a bunch of different factors that have also allowed them. I think we saw in the beginning of the semester, I usually show a map, and you can see down here as well, the line between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. This isn't quite as drastic as a different picture I normally see, but you can still see the clear distinction. There are virtually no forests left in the Haitian side, but there are quite a few forests left on the Dominican side. And again, this is largely due to policy, but it's also largely due to people's access to what kind of fuels they have for cooking. So most states in the Caribbean are dependent on foreign energy sources. Trinidad and Tobago are really pretty much the only exception, but most of them are still reliant on importing energy and importing energy sources to produce their own energy. Haiti is still dependent on charcoal, as we saw, which is leading to more deforestation pressures. And there is, largely speaking, there's a growing interest in renewable energy in the islands. In this region, it's a region that it's kind of a make or break, and very similar to our own archipelago, where we don't have a source of fossil fuel. We really need to find a way, if we're going to make a sustainable move into the future, we need to find a way to use renewable energies from wind and solar as well. But a lot of the problems associated with wind and solar is actually, how do you store the energy? You can produce the energy, but how is it stored so that, and this is what the batteries, the technology doesn't really exist at a large scale. This is something that still needs to be worked out. And the cost as well for what technology does exist. So some conservation efforts. There is a lot of biological diversity and stability. It is less threatened in the Rimland states. Again, this is partially due to the fact that you're not quite on an island. You have more land, you have more resources. Islands are really limited, and this is kind of something we see around the world. Here's the pictures of the howler monkey. You can see while this is tourism, it's also, there's a lot of, this animal's obviously very habituated to humans. That's not really helping conservation. There's a lot of different factors. You can spread disease to the species can spread disease to the humans. The species can go up to other people who aren't friendly tourists, or they can become aggressive. There's a lot of issues with this kind of tourism. But we definitely need more protected areas, and we're seeing this pop up in some of these areas. Okay, so population and settlement. Relatively speaking, in this region, we have very high population density. 85% of the population live in the Greater Antilles, which makes sense, right? You can see for our Rimland states, there's not necessarily a lot of people, but you can see, the Lesser Antilles, we're not talking about a lot of land, so it kind of makes sense that 85% of the population is going to live. It's also a very urbanized place. So some of the demographic trends we're seeing, we see high mortality rates of native populations, not so much today, but upon early inhabitants coming in. So for example, in the Caribbean, there were two primary native populations, the Caribs and the Tainos, and both of these were pretty much decimated within 50 years of Columbus's arrival, again, largely due to the introduction of diseases. Again, you needed people to do the work, especially when we're talking about plantation agriculture. So we saw continual importation of African slaves, and this was required, again, due to the high death rates, not only of the African slaves, but of the previous indigenous people. Again, it's really impressive, not in a good way, but it's impressive how many, you can go and you can Google or YouTube, look at like the importation of African slaves, and you see the number of boats that arrived and the number of boats that arrived to this region. When we talk about slavery of Africans I think from a U.S. perspective, we often think of it just from a U.S. perspective, but realistically speaking, the importation of African slaves was pandemic through all of the Americans and the Caribbean, especially on the eastern coast. So we are seeing fertility decline, and longer lives. So increases in life expectancy. However, the peak growth rates, they were higher. So they were about 3 point, which, remember, the rate of natural increase in order for the population to continually be replenished is at 2 point. This is a question on your exams. Make sure you can go and find it. I'm not telling you the point. You need to go find it for yourselves. So this was resulting in population growth, right? Now we're finally seeing this slow down. So if you think about the demographic transition model a little bit, some societal and economic factors are also influencing. And then what a lot of people aren't aware of is actually this region is largely impacted by HIV/AIDS, which is quite prolific in the area. The situation is improving, however, and this is largely through education and access to contraceptives and healthcare as well. But the rates are still twice as high as that of the United States. So it's estimated approximately 1% of the population in the region has HIV/AIDS, which might not sound like a lot, but it is. And then to break it down for you, because again, there's, excuse me, it's quite skewed. 1.8% of the population in Haiti between the ages of 15 to 49 are believed to have HIV or AIDS. 1.8% of the population in Jamaica, 2.3% of the population in Belize, and 2.8% of the population in Bahamas. And these are estimates. Obviously, you can't do a census and force people to give you that information. We're also seeing, there's still a lot of poverty. There's a lot of gender inequality. There's a lot of misinformation regarding AIDS. There's still, when I live in Ecuador as well, this was even just a little over 10 years ago. I was participating in something with the Department of Health, and there were still people who believed that HIV/AIDS was a quote-unquote gay disease. So there still is a lot of misinformation that can lead to this. There's a lot of stigma associated with people who have the disease, and there's a lot of sex trade industry in the area. And then with the high amounts of tourism, usually you see, especially like boat-based tourism, cruise-based tourism, a lot of people, it kind of leads to a lot of promiscuous activity. And this also then influences, obviously, the amount of HIV/AIDS. So just a couple of other demographic trends. You can see here, again, there's a huge disparity. We've got on the right, we've got Haiti, very triangular, very pyramid-shaped, very stereotypical of peripheral and developing nations. So there's a very low life expectancy. A lot of what we see in Sub-Saharan Africa, or what we will see in Sub-Saharan Africa, so there's not a lot of older people, which is very evident here. There's a high rate of fertility, so a lot of people are having a lot of children. Cuba, on the other hand, Cuba is a really interesting one. As we talked about when we saw this first, that you can also see social trends that happen, or historical trends. Cuba actually has a very high rate of education and literacy. They have a really good access to healthcare as well. They have a lot of access to birth control. So with this, we've seen a huge drop in fertility, and today pretty low fertility rates. And what's interesting here regarding the historical trend is you can see evidence of the Cuban Revolution as well as socialism. But you can see where there was a huge drop in the population. It doesn't look like there's definitely, actually I'd have to say the opposite. It looks like there's more males than females. I'm trying to look further up. It looks generally the same. But so yeah, again, better healthcare, better access to healthcare. We're seeing longer life expectancies as well. Immigration is an interesting concept that is very relevant in this area. So we're going to learn about the concept of a diaspora. A diaspora is basically a group of people or a community that spreads out to other places. In this case, the Caribbean diaspora, it's more of an economic flight. So people are leaving for economic reasons. There's not necessarily a lot of jobs that can be had, or income is quite low. There's a lot of areas that are largely stricken by poverty. So you do see a lot of out-migration. You see a lot of in-migration from wealthy people as well. If I ask how many people want to go live in the Caribbean, a lot of people might be interested. So some examples of some of, for example, 10% of Jamaicans, which is a huge chunk of the population, fled to the U.S. in the 1980s. There's high negative net migration rates. So this is about 4 people for every 1,000 people leave per year. And again, it's quite skewed. So some countries have up to 15 people per 1,000, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that actually is quite a bit. And you can see where people go. I actually had met a man in Spain who was from the Dominican Republic, traveled to Venezuela. From Venezuela, he found it easier to get an immigrant visa or work visa, it might have been, to Spain. And then his goal was actually to move to the Bronx, where I was living at the time. And I was just thinking, no, you don't. You've got a nice life here in Spain. But you can see just how the routes that some people have to do. Cuba is also, with the agreement that we have with Cuba, if you can actually set foot, so I think it's 90 miles between Cuba and the United States, if you can set foot on dry land on the United States and you're a Cuban refugee, you actually instantly get political asylum. But you have to set foot on dry land. Okay, we'll just cover this last bit here about the urban development, and then I'll stop and we'll do part 2. So this region is largely known as, it's very similar to what we call Plantation America, much similar to what we saw in the United States. The rule for a lot of these were colonies. They were ruled by European elites. They were very dependent on African labor force, which we've talked about, and the type of agricultural production that they did was actually monocrop. A lot of sugar, a lot of tobacco, a lot of cotton, a lot of one crop that was vastly spread out throughout the islands. And a lot of the economic patterns, as well as the institutional structure that we see today, are very what we call this colonial legacy. So it's still evident of the patterns that existed during colonial times are still existent today. So this is what we refer to as colonial legacy. Caribbean cities today, generally speaking in the region, about 66% on average is urbanized, so 66% of the population lives in urban areas. Puerto Rico is 99%, which that seems really high, and this was again post Maria, I think, was the hurricane that hit them the largest, whereas Haiti only has about 53% of the population is urbanized. And none of the cities are really large compared to world standards. So only 5 cities have 1 million or more. But still, we're talking about, kind of consider Honolulu, for example. They could be quite similar to our island. And there is a very strong influence of colonial today, and as well as the culture, the mix of cultures that exists. And your book has a really interesting example of urban gardens in Havana, that this program, which is a really important thing when we're talking about cities, especially in places like islands that can be quite limited in land, but we've seen this huge boom in urban agriculture in Havana. Interestingly enough, you can't just go to Cuba today for any reason, but if it's for educational purposes, as well as a couple different other purposes, you can get a visa to go. I know that there's people, they have the Havana Marathon, but they also have like a 5K or a 10K, and if you register for that, you can actually get a visa and go. So tourism is a relatively new thing that has been recently opened up in Cuba. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop it from here, and we'll come back for part 2. Have a great day.